Get ready for a chilling night. Immerse yourself in horror stories that will accompany you until you sleep. If these dark narratives help you delve into the world of dreams, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more eerily peaceful nights. Have you heard of the Bloody Bride Bridge legend? Many say a ghostly bride haunts an abandoned bridge in Wisconsin. But what if I told you a normal night could turn into a nightmare you'll never forget? My friends and I decided to challenge the legend. We parked on the bridge, waited, and then she appeared, just like the stories say. I wasn't expecting much when I first heard about the legend of the Bloody Bride. You hear things like that all the time when you're new to a place. The locals tell you stories, and you laugh them off, thinking they're just trying to give you a good scare. But after spending a few months at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, I learned that the Bloody Bride was no joke. A friend of mine, a librarian who knew everything about local folklore, first told me about it. She said that the bridge on Highway 66 was haunted by a bride who had died in a car accident on her wedding night. The way she described it, it was as if she had seen the ghost herself. But I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories easily. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just another one of those horror stories meant to scare newcomers. As Halloween approached, the idea of the Bloody Bride lingered in the back of my mind. It seemed like the perfect night to test the legend. I convinced my boyfriend and my sister to come with me to the bridge. They weren't thrilled about it, especially my sister, who had to sit in the back seat of the car. But we all figured it would make for a good story to tell later. The night was cold, with the moon barely peeking through the dense pines lining the highway. We parked on the bridge and waited. The silence was eerie, only broken by the occasional rustling of the trees and the distant sound of water flowing beneath us. The road ahead of us was dark, stretching into the unknown, and for a moment I felt a chill run down my spine. As the clock struck midnight, we all stared into the darkness, waiting for something, anything to happen. Minutes passed, and nothing. My boyfriend sighed and reached for the car keys, clearly disappointed. We all figured the legend was just that, a story made to spook the gullible. He started the car, and I could feel the tension easing in the small space. We were ready to leave, laugh it off, and forget about the whole thing. But just as the engine roared to life, the radio blared static, filling the car with a sound so jarring that I instinctively covered my ears. He fumbled with the dial, trying to shut it off, but every channel was the same, nothing but that horrible screeching noise. And then we saw her. She was standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by our headlights. At first I thought it was a real woman, a bride no less, in her bloodied wedding dress. But the longer I stared, the more I realized something was terribly wrong. Her dark hair was matted with blood, and her skin was so pale it seemed almost translucent. A gash across her chest where the seatbelt must have cut into her flesh was still raw, even after all these years. One leg bent awkwardly, as if broken, yet she stood perfectly still. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, staring right at us. Before I could react, the car jerked backward. My boyfriend slammed the gear into reverse, his hands trembling on the wheel. We tore down the highway, the tires screeching against the asphalt, but I couldn't take my eyes off the rearview mirror. She remained there on the bridge, watching us, her figure growing smaller and smaller as we sped away. I'll never forget that night, no matter how much I try to push it out of my mind. The Bloody Bride is no myth. She is out there, still waiting for the next car to stop on that bridge, ready to show herself once more. The air inside the car was thick with a tense silence. None of us spoke as we hurtled back toward Stevens Point. The road seemed to stretch on forever, like some endless loop that refused to let us escape. The static from the radio had been silenced, but the eerie feeling it left behind clung to me. My hands were cold, even with the heater blasting, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her sitting in the back seat. We didn't talk about what had just happened. I think we were all too scared to say it out loud, afraid that acknowledging it might make it worse. Instead, we just drove in silence, the headlights cutting through the darkness as the world outside seemed to close in around us. It was the kind of quiet that made the smallest sound seem deafening: the hum of the engine, the crunch of gravel under the tires, the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. Every little noise seemed like it could be something more, something dangerous lurking just out of sight. I couldn't stop thinking about her, the way she looked so real, So broken and yet so wrong. Horror stories always seemed far-fetched until you found yourself living one. I'd had enough scary stories in my life, but none of them had prepared me for this. This wasn't just a story. This was something that would stay with me forever. Something that would haunt my dreams and make me second-guess every shadow I saw in the dark. We eventually made it back to town, though it felt like an eternity had passed since we had left the bridge. The familiar streets and houses didn't bring the comfort they usually did. Everything seemed different now, tainted by what we had seen. My boyfriend parked the car outside my apartment, and we all just sat there for a moment, still too shaken to move. Finally, I broke the silence. "Did you see her too?" My voice sounded small, almost afraid of the answer. He nodded slowly, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. "Yeah, I saw her." My sister in the back seat didn't say anything. She just stared straight ahead, her eyes wide, as if still seeing the bloody bride standing in the road. We didn't need to say anything else. We all knew what we had witnessed. As we stepped out of the car, the cool night air hit me, and I shivered. The town was quiet, with only the distant hum of traffic on the highway. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us, lurking in the shadows. The drive back hadn't been enough to escape her presence. The bloody bride had marked us, and I knew she would always be there, in the back of my mind, waiting to resurface whenever I crossed another dark road at night. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face pale, bloodied, and hollow. The memory of her standing in the middle of the road replayed over and over, refusing to let me rest. The rain sounds outside my window, usually soothing, only added to the unease, making it impossible to find peace. It was as if the very night itself had taken on a life of its own, filled with a darkness that I couldn't escape. I thought about all the stories I had heard over the years, all the tales of ghosts and hauntings, and realized that they weren't just bedtime stories. They were real. Somewhere out there, in the dark corners of the world, these horrors existed. And now, I had my own story to tell, a true story, one that I wished I could forget. As the hours dragged on, I finally drifted off into a fitful sleep. But even then, the bloody bride followed me. She was always there, standing in the middle of the road, waiting. The next morning came too soon, the pale light of dawn filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows across my room. I hadn't slept much, and when I did, the dreams were worse than the restless hours. The bloody bride haunted me, sometimes standing in the middle of the road, sometimes sitting in the back seat, her eyes fixed on me through the rearview mirror. No matter where I turned, she was there, bloodied and broken. I rolled out of bed, exhausted. My mind kept replaying the events of the night before. The image of her burned into my memory every time I closed my eyes. And I saw her standing in front of the car, daring us to move forward. It was the kind of experience that made you question everything what you saw, what you knew to be real. Horror stories used to be just that, stories, but now they had become something else entirely. I tried to go about my day as if nothing had happened, but the weight of that night clung to me like a dark cloud. The rain sounds outside, usually calming, now reminded me of that silent, eerie night on the bridge. The rhythmic patter against the window seemed almost mocking, like it was hiding something just beyond the glass. Every reflection, every shadow felt suspicious, as if the bloody bride might appear at any moment. As I went about my day, I couldn't help but notice that my sister and boyfriend were also shaken. We didn't talk about it, we didn't need to. The silence between us was heavy, filled with the unspoken understanding that what we had experienced was real. It wasn't some scary story to laugh off at a campfire. It was something that had reached out of the past to touch us, to mark us. Later that evening, I found myself staring at the rearview mirror in my car again. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still with us, that somehow we hadn't truly escaped her. The car felt different now, tainted by that night. Every time I looked into the mirror, I half expected to see her sitting in the back seat, her lifeless eyes staring back at me. That night, as I tried to sleep again, the nightmares returned. This time, I wasn't just a passenger in the car. I was the driver, and she was in the back seat. I could feel her presence, cold and menacing, and no matter how hard I tried to look away, the rearview mirror seemed to draw my gaze back to her. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The image of her face burned into my mind. Sleep horror became my nightly reality, a terrifying loop that wouldn't let go. The nightmares, the rain sounds outside, the quiet whispers of fear, it all blurred together into something I couldn't escape. I tried everything: sleep aids, soothing sounds, bedtime stories meant to calm my mind, but nothing worked. The bloody bride had followed me home, and no amount of relaxing horror techniques could chase her away. Days passed and the fear didn't fade. It was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I couldn't drive at night without checking the rearview mirror constantly, expecting her to appear at any moment. Even during the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The world had changed, and so had I. Eventually, I realized that this was my new reality. The bloody bride wasn't just a legend anymore. She was a part of my life, a ghost that would follow me wherever I went. And no matter how much I wanted to forget that night, to push it aside as just another scary tale, I knew I couldn't. She was always there, just beyond the edge of sleep, waiting. And so, I lived with it, trying to move on, trying to accept that some things can't be explained away. They just are. The world is full of horror stories, true stories that we try to ignore. But sometimes, they find us, and when they do, they leave a mark that never really fades. Even now, I still see her sometimes in reflections, in shadows, in the quiet moments when the world goes still. She's there, watching, reminding me that some things are never really over. Months passed, but the memory of that night refused to let go. It was like a scar that hadn't healed properly, a wound that still stung when touched. Life moved on around me, but I was stuck, replaying that night on the Bloody Bride Bridge over and over again. Every time I drove past a dark stretch of road, every time I heard the soft patter of rain on the windshield, I couldn't help but feel that she was still there, just out of sight. It didn't help that sleep had become a battleground. I dreaded the night, knowing that when I closed my eyes, she would be waiting for me. The nightmares had become relentless, each one more vivid than the last. I would wake up gasping for breath, the image of her bloodied face seared into my mind. No amount of sleep aids or bedtime stories could ease me into restful slumber. The bloody bride had claimed my nights, and I was powerless to stop her. The nights grew longer as winter approached, and the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. The rain sounds that used to comfort me now filled me with dread. Every time the sky darkened and the rain began to fall, I would brace myself for what might come. The world had taken on an eerie quality, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. And then it did. It was late one night when I found myself driving alone down a deserted road on the outskirts of town. The rain had started up again, lightly at first, then steadily increasing until it was pouring down in sheets. The wipers struggled to keep up, and the road ahead was a blur of water and shadows. I hadn't meant to end up on this road, but a wrong turn had brought me here, and now there was no going back. As I drove, a familiar sense of unease settled over me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her sitting there, as she had been in my dreams so many times, but the back seat was empty. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. It was as if the night itself had come alive, wrapping around me, closing in. Up ahead, I saw a figure on the side of the road. My heart skipped a beat, and I slowed the car, squinting through the rain. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, the figure took shape: a woman, standing there in the rain, wearing a long white dress. I froze. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. It couldn't be her. It wasn't possible. But as I approached, there was no denying it. She stood there, soaked from head to toe, her hair plastered to her face, her dress stained with dark streaks of what looked like blood. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't move. The car idled, the engine humming softly as I stared at her, unable to tear my eyes away. She was real, standing right in front of me, just as she had on the Bloody Bride Bridge. But this time, there was no one else with me. I was alone. The rain pounded on the roof of the car, drowning out the sound of my own heartbeat. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way. She just stood there, staring down the road, as if waiting for something or someone. I didn't know what to do. Should I drive past her? Should I turn around and speed away as fast as I could? But my hands wouldn't move, and my foot remained frozen on the brake. Then, slowly, she turned her head toward me, her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. There was something in those eyes, something dark and empty, something that shouldn't have been there. It was as if she could see right through me, as if she knew every fear I had ever had. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. One moment she was standing there, and the next, the road was empty again. I blinked, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had she been real, or was this just another nightmare, one that I couldn't wake up from? I didn't wait to find out. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped away, the tires screeching on the wet pavement. The road ahead was a blur as I raced toward the safety of home, not daring to look back. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, trying to calm my racing heart. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, tapping lightly against the windshield. I couldn't stop shaking. The bloody bride was still out there, somewhere, waiting in the shadows, and I knew, deep down, that she would never truly leave me. No matter where I went, no matter how far I tried to run, she would always be there. The world was full of horror stories, true stories that we try to forget, but some stories never fade. They linger, haunting us, reminding us that some things can't be explained away. And as I sat there, staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror, I realized that this was my story now, one that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. It was Easter weekend in 1993, and I was living in the San Luis Valley in Colorado. Strange things always seemed to happen in that area, but most of them stayed within the realm of rumor and speculation. It was late in the afternoon when I found myself sitting across from the chief of police in Cuesta, New Mexico. We were discussing the usual, a case of cattle mutilation that had taken place not too far from town. As the conversation dragged on, I couldn't help but wonder about other stories that might have passed through his desk. "So," I asked him, more out of curiosity than anything else, if he'd ever encountered anything truly strange. He hesitated, and I thought I might have crossed a line, but then he spoke. "I don't usually talk about this," he began, leaning forward as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. "But my uncle had an experience on Highway 522 that shook him to his core. It's a story that still gives me chills, and I'm not one for believing in ghost tales or scary stories, but this, well, it was different." The chief's uncle was driving home late one night, just north of Cuesta. It was Easter weekend, and the air was crisp and quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only one left in the world. The headlights of his truck cut through the darkness. As he made his way down Highway 522, the road was empty. Just the sound of the engine humming and the occasional rain sound tapping against the windshield, a relaxing horror in the stillness of the night. That's when he saw her, a woman, dressed in red, walking along the side of the highway. There wasn't another car in sight, and he couldn't fathom why anyone would be out there in the middle of nowhere. Naturally, he pulled over, thinking she might be in trouble. Without a word, she climbed into the passenger seat, her face expressionless. He asked if she needed help, but she didn't respond. She just sat there, silent as the grave. He felt a chill run down his spine, but he brushed it off as nerves. The strange thing was, as he continued driving, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He glanced over at her, trying to make sense of the situation, and that's when he saw her legs. They weren't human. Her lower half resembled that of a goat, with cloven hooves resting where feet should have been. Before he could react, she vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but an empty seat beside him. The chief paused after sharing that part of the story, his eyes distant as if he was picturing it all over again. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but I didn't say anything. He continued, clearly uneasy about the memory. My uncle wasn't the kind of man who got scared easily. He was level-headed, the sort of person who could handle just about anything. But when he got home that night, he was pale as a ghost. He didn't sleep, didn't he just sat there in the living room, staring at the wall. It was like he'd seen something that his mind couldn't quite process, something that wasn't supposed to exist. The next day, the chief's uncle went straight to the police station. He insisted on making a report, though the officers tried to talk him out of it. They didn't want a story like that getting out. For obvious reasons, people don't react well to true stories about strange encounters on lonely highways. But the man wouldn't be swayed. He wrote down every detail he could remember: how the woman had appeared, the way she'd silently climbed into his truck, and most importantly, how she had goat's legs and cloven hooves. The officers reluctantly filed it away, never intending to investigate further. After all, what could they do with a story like that? Over the next few days, word got around town. It wasn't long before people started sharing their own scary tales, whispering about strange figures seen on the road at night, or odd occurrences that couldn't be explained. Some dismissed it as nonsense, while others swore they had seen similar things over the years. The local diner buzzed with conversation about the mysterious hitchhiker in red. It became one of those bedtime stories you tell when the wind howls outside and the rain patters against the roof, adding to the eerie atmosphere. But it wasn't just the locals who were interested. Soon enough, the story started to spread beyond Cuesta. Travelers passing through began asking about the haunted stretch of Highway 522. Rumors circulated that if you drove that road alone at night, you might see her walking along the side of the road, waiting for someone to pick her up. And if you did, well, you might not make it to your destination. People began avoiding that route after dark, afraid of becoming the next scary compilation in the town's growing collection of eerie narratives. The chief's uncle never recovered from that night. He refused to drive at night anymore, and he never took Highway 522 again. He spent the rest of his days trying to make sense of what he had seen, but he never found any answers. Some said it was just a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by fatigue or stress, but those who knew him best didn't believe that. They saw the fear in his eyes, the way he flinched at the sound of rain sounds on the roof, or the distant hum of an engine on a quiet night. Whatever he had encountered that Easter weekend, it had left a mark on him, one that would never fade. Years passed, but the legend of the woman in red persisted. It became one of those local horror stories that everyone knew but didn't talk about too openly. When people mentioned Highway 522, there was always a hushed tone, a glance over the shoulder, as if speaking of it might somehow summon her. Most of the truckers and travelers had learned to avoid the road after dark, especially on nights when the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, or when the fog rolled in, making everything look like a scene from a nightmare. But there were always the curious ones, the skeptics, and the daredevils. I guess that's how I found myself on that road one night, nearly a decade later. I had heard the stories, of course. The truck stops and diners along my route were filled with whispered tales about the vanishing hitchhiker. The scary stories that truckers swapped over coffee late at night. But like most, I didn't really believe it. I figured it was just another urban legend, one of those stories that gets twisted and exaggerated over time until it barely resembles the truth. That night was one of those typical long hauls. I was coming back from Taos, heading toward the state line, and the quickest way home was down Highway 522. It was late, probably close to midnight, and the road was deserted, not a single car in sight. Just miles of empty pavement stretching ahead of me. The rain started coming down hard, tapping against the windshield in a rhythmic beat, the kind that makes you sleepy if you're not careful. I adjusted the radio, searching for something to keep me awake, but all I could find were static-filled stations and old country tunes. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a figure, walking along the shoulder. My heart skipped a beat as I slowed down, squinting through the rain to get a better look. She was dressed in red just like in the stories, her hair wet and matted to her face. She walked with an eerie calm, not even flinching as my headlights illuminated her. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I couldn't look away. My mind raced with the possibilities. Was this it? Was I really seeing the infamous hitchhiker, the one that had scared so many before me? Against my better judgment, I pulled over. My hands were trembling as I rolled down the window, calling out to her. "Hey, you need a ride?" She turned to face me, and for a moment, I could have sworn she smiled, a small, almost sad smile. Without a word, She walked over to the passenger side and climbed into the cab. I didn't dare look down at her legs, even though every fiber of my being wanted to. Instead, I focused on the road ahead, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. The silence was suffocating. She didn't say a word, didn't even seem to notice me. She just stared straight ahead, her eyes locked on some distant point in the darkness. I tried to think of something to say, some way to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. All I could hear was the sound of the rain and the steady hum of the engine, both blending together into a kind of hypnotic lullaby. The road stretched on, disappearing into the darkness as the rain intensified. The silence in the cab became unbearable, heavy with an unspoken tension that gnawed at my nerves. My mind raced with thoughts of those old true stories, the ones truckers would share in hushed voices over midnight coffee. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat reverberating in my ears like a distant drum. The woman beside me remained still, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. She hadn't moved since Shed climbed into the truck, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I finally mustered the courage to glance at her, just a quick sideways look. She looked so normal, so human, but that only made it worse. There was something off about her, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. My mind kept going back to the stories, the ones that always ended with the hitchhiker disappearing without a trace. I clenched the wheel tighter, trying to keep my focus on driving, but the fear was creeping in, cold and relentless. I tried to break the silence. "So, where are you headed?" My voice sounded too loud in the confined space of the cab, jarring against the constant drumming of the rain. She didn't answer, didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken. The air grew thick with tension, like a storm waiting to break. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. There was no way out of this now. I was on that road in that moment, and all I could do was keep driving. As we passed a stretch of desolate road, I felt a sudden urge to look down at her legs, but I fought it. I didn't want to see, didn't want to confirm what my gut was telling me. My mind kept screaming for me to stop, to pull over and get out, but something held me in place. Something stronger than fear, maybe curiosity, maybe disbelief. Whatever it was, it kept me going forward, even as the dread built up in my chest like a heavy weight. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. One moment, she was there, sitting beside me, and the next, the seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing, and the truck skidded to a halt. The rain continued to pour down, but inside the cab it was eerily quiet. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty seat, trying to process what had just happened. My hands shook as I reached for the door, half expecting her to reappear, but there was nothing, just the rain and the dark, empty road ahead. I never spoke of that night again, but the memory stayed with me, haunting the edges of my mind like a shadow that never quite goes away. To this day, I don't know what I saw, or if it was just a trick of the mind. But every time I hear rain sounds or pass by that stretch of highway, I feel a chill down my spine, a reminder of that night when I came face to face with the unknown. It was one of those moments that changes you, makes you realize just how thin the line is between reality and the things that lurk in the dark. And every now and then, when I pass another trucker on the road, I wonder if they've heard the same bedtime stories, the same narrative scary, and if they too have met the devil in red. I was driving my rig down a narrow stretch of highway in northeast Oklahoma, a routine haul that had become all too familiar. The road was quiet, stretching out endlessly beneath the night sky. The radio buzzed softly with static, the kind that filled the void of silence on lonely roads. The rain sounds tapping against the windshield were almost soothing, a stark contrast to the story I was about to become a part of. It was just past 11 p.m., and I was hoping to wrap things up before midnight. Little did I know the night had different plans for me. My route had taken me through areas I'd driven countless times, but tonight was peculiar. As I made a sharp turn onto a gravel road marked Devil's Promenade, a name I'd heard of, but never paid much attention to, I felt a shiver. The road was eerily empty, save for a few scattered trees and the constant drip of rain that had been falling since dusk. I had heard stories about the Hornet spook light, a mysterious orb that supposedly danced down this very road. Of course, I didn't believe in such things. At least, I didn't until tonight. As I drove slowly down the road, the lights of my truck barely cut through the darkness. I couldn't help but let my imagination run wild. I knew the legends. An orange ball of light, moving in unpredictable ways. Some said it was the ghost of a lover. Others claimed it was a miner searching for his family. I chuckled to myself, dismissing these as nothing more than local folklore. But the road had a strange feeling about it. A chill that wasn't just from the rain. About halfway down the gravel road I saw it. At first it was a mere flicker in the distance. A dull orange glow that seemed to float above the treetops. My heart rate quickened as the light grew larger and more defined. It moved erratically, weaving left and right, as if it was being carried by an invisible hand. I pulled over. Not out of fear, but curiosity. I had to see this for myself, even if I wasn't sure what I was looking at. The light was mesmerizing. It swayed as if it were a lantern carried by someone unseen. I checked my watch. 11:45 p.m. The spook light seemed to hover just above the treetops, growing brighter and then dimming, as if it were breathing. I fumbled for my phone to take a picture, but as soon as I tried, the light vanished. The night fell silent, save for the rhythmic tap of rain against my truck. It was as if the light had never been there. The eerie silence that followed the disappearance of the light left me unsettled. I sat in the cab of my truck, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The rain had let up a bit, but the road was still slick. My thoughts were racing. Was it just a trick of the light? Some reflection? I shook my head and started the engine, determined to finish my delivery and leave this unsettling road behind. As I drove further down Devil's Promenade, I noticed something strange. The road seemed to stretch endlessly. I had driven down this road before, but tonight, it felt different. The darkness seemed thicker, almost tangible. The usual landmarks weren't visible, and I had the unnerving sensation that the road was somehow longer than it should be. Then, out of nowhere, I spotted another vehicle's headlights in the distance. It was unusual to see anyone out here at this hour. As I got closer, the lights became clearer, revealing a beat-up old truck. It was parked on the side of the road, and the driver was standing outside, staring at the ground. I pulled up alongside them, rolling down my window. "Hey there," I called out. "Everything all right?" The driver looked up, revealing a face etched with weariness. "Just had a flat," he said. "Can't get it changed out here. It's too dark." I offered to help, but as I stepped out of my truck, the man's gaze shifted to the trees behind us. His eyes widened. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing. I turned to look, but the only thing I saw was the dark expanse of the forest. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice tinged with irritation and unease. "The light," he said. "It's back." I strained my eyes, but the orange glow was nowhere to be seen. I started to doubt my sanity. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or my imagination. I tried to focus on helping the driver, but the sight of him watching the forest with growing anxiety made me uneasy. As I worked on the truck, the rain started up again, drumming steadily on the roof. The driver kept glancing nervously at the trees, mumbling about the spook light and strange happenings on this road. His fear was palpable, and despite my rational mind, I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. The night had taken a turn for the worse, and I couldn't ignore the eerie feeling settling in my chest. With the flat tire fixed and the driver on his way, I felt a mix of relief and unease. The strange encounter had left me more rattled than I cared to admit. I climbed back into my rig, determined to finish my journey. The rain had returned, heavier this time, and the windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour. The road stretched ahead, seemingly endless, and the darkness outside felt like a thick, oppressive blanket. As I drove on, my mind kept drifting back to the orange light. The way it had appeared and vanished was unsettling. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing instead on the road and my destination. But the further I went, the more I began to question my own perceptions. Had I really seen something unusual, or was it just the rain playing tricks on my eyes? Suddenly, a flicker of light caught my attention in the rearview mirror. My heart skipped a beat as I saw the orange glow again, this time trailing behind me. I pulled over quickly, hoping to catch a better look. I scanned the area, but the light had vanished as abruptly as it had appeared. The rain poured down harder now, creating a curtain of water that obscured my view. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, even though I knew it was impossible. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The sound of the rain against the truck and the occasional rumble of thunder seemed to amplify the silence. I took a deep breath and decided to press on, telling myself it was just a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. But as I resumed driving, the orange light appeared once more, this time directly in front of me, bobbing and weaving down the road. I felt a chill run down my spine. The light moved in a way that defied logic, darting from side to side, rising and falling as if it were alive. I stopped the truck again, watching in stunned silence. The light grew brighter and dimmer, more erratic with each passing second. My mind raced with explanations, none of which made sense. The light seemed to be taunting me, a reminder of the strange legends I had dismissed so easily. The light grew more intense as I approached, casting an eerie orange glow on the wet gravel road. I felt a mix of fear and fascination as I continued to watch it move. My instincts told me to turn back, but a stubborn curiosity kept me driving forward. I wanted to understand what I was witnessing, even if it meant confronting my own fears. As I got closer, the light seemed to merge with the shadows, blending into the darkness around me. I slowed down, my eyes straining to follow its movements. The rain pounded harder, creating a relentless backdrop of noise that drowned out everything else. I was alone on this desolate stretch of road, and the sense of isolation was almost palpable. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the light disappeared. I stopped the truck, the engine idling as I scanned the road ahead. The darkness was absolute, with only the occasional flash of lightning revealing the landscape. I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Whatever the light was, it had vanished, leaving me with more questions than answers. I turned the truck around, heading back toward the main road. The journey felt longer than it should have, the oppressive silence only broken by the sound of the rain. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The theories and legends seemed to swirl around me, none of them providing a clear answer. I couldn't shake the feeling that the night had changed something within me, that I had witnessed something beyond my understanding. As I finally reached the highway and the familiar lights of civilization, I took a deep breath and tried to push the night's events from my mind. I would tell the story, of course, but I knew that the true nature of the spook light would remain a mystery. Some things, I realized, are meant to remain unexplained, lingering in the shadows of our imagination. The Devil's Promenade had left its mark on me, a reminder that the world is full of mysteries, some of which we are better off not fully understanding. Born and bred in Louisville, Kentucky, I've heard my fair share of local legends, but nothing quite compares to the tale of Hot Rod Haven. This curvy stretch of road, winding through dense woods and flanked by a cemetery, has always fascinated me. It ends in a sharp curve that leads to a steep drop-off, making it a notorious spot for accidents. The stories surrounding this road are as twisted as the road itself, filled with eerie events and dark legends. Hot Rod Haven isn't just another road. It's a legend wrapped in fear and superstition. At one time, 13 trees along the road were marked with red paint. The 13th tree in particular was said to resemble Satan's face within the bark, a bizarre and unsettling sight. According to local lore, if you didn't count all 13 trees correctly, you were doomed to crash on the final turn where the road sharply dropped off. I hadn't driven down Hot Rod Haven in years, but the story stuck with me. I recall hearing about the peculiar events that were said to occur on Halloween night. It was rumored that at a specific time, though the exact hour eluded me, a group of spectral figures, those who had perished in wrecks on the road, would appear. These ghostly apparitions would walk the road until they reached the 13th tree, at which point they would vanish into thin air. On a particularly chilly evening, with rain pattering softly against my windshield, I decided to drive down Hot Rod Haven to see if the legends held any truth. The cemetery's silhouette loomed ominously in the mist, its presence almost a character in the narrative of the road. The thought of the 13 trees and the ghostly figures created a chill that had nothing to do with the cold weather outside. As I drove, the road twisted and turned, the red paint on the trees barely visible through the gloom. The rain provided a rhythmic backdrop, its constant drumming adding a layer of unease. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the darkness. I focused on counting them, hoping to avoid the curse of the 13th tree and the dreaded drop-off. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with every passing second, my heart pounding with each curve. The road seemed to stretch endlessly as I drove through the dense woods. The rain was relentless, its rhythmic drumming on the roof a constant reminder of the night's eerie atmosphere. I kept my eyes on the road, but the trees marked with their red paint felt like eyes watching me from the shadows. As I approached what I hoped was the halfway point, I noticed the 13th tree. It was marked distinctly, its red paint almost glowing faintly through the mist. The supposed likeness of Satan's face seemed more like a grotesque trick of the light and bark. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I pushed it aside. I needed to focus on counting the trees and making sure I didn't make a mistake. The legends I had heard were playing in my mind like a broken record. Count the trees or crash at the curve. It was absurd, but the rain and the darkness made the story seem a little more plausible. I glanced at the curve ahead, where the road dipped steeply. The drop-off loomed in my mind as a stark reminder of the risks. My thoughts were interrupted by a flash of movement in my peripheral vision. For a split second, I thought I saw something or someone moving between the trees. I stopped the truck and stared into the darkness, but there was nothing. The trees stood silent and unmoving, the rain washing over them in a steady stream. I shook my head, chalking it up to overactive imagination and the unsettling atmosphere. I drove on, my gaze fixed on the curve where the road would eventually drop off. The legend had a way of getting under your skin, especially in the dead of night with nothing but the sound of the rain for company. The tension was palpable, making every turn feel like a step closer to an impending doom. The road grew narrower and the trees more twisted as I approached the final stretch. The curve ahead was shrouded in thick fog, making it nearly impossible to see what lay beyond. I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that had settled in my chest. The constant patter of rain against the truck's roof seemed louder now, almost deafening. As I neared the curve, the headlights of my truck cut through the fog, revealing the treacherous drop-off below. I kept my speed in check, my heart racing as I navigated the sharp turn. The road seemed to twist in unnatural ways, the trees pressing in on either side as if trying to squeeze the life out of the vehicle. It was then that I saw them figures moving slowly along the edge of the road. They appeared as shadows at first, but as I got closer, their forms became clearer. They were dressed in clothes that looked old-fashioned, as if they had stepped out of another era. Their movements were slow and deliberate, almost as if they were bound by some unseen force. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the wet surface. My breath came in short, sharp bursts as I stared at the figures. They seemed to be walking towards the 13th tree, just as the legend had described. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination, but the sight was too vivid, too real. I watched in disbelief as the figures reached the 13th tree and, true to the legend, began to fade away. The fog swallowed them up, leaving only the eerie silence and the steady rhythm of the rain. I was left with a profound sense of dread and confusion. What had I just witnessed? The legends of Hot Rod Haven had always seemed like folklore, but seeing those figures with my own eyes was a different story altogether. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing in on me as I sat in the truck, my mind racing. The figures were gone, leaving only the heavy silence and the persistent rain. I tried to process what I had just seen, but the eerie spectacle made it difficult to think clearly. The legend had come to life in a way I never expected. I forced myself to drive slowly away from the curve, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. The road stretched out ahead, but it felt like a lifetime before I reached the end. As I navigated the winding path, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, lurking in the darkness. When I finally reached the end of Hot Rod Haven and the main road, I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The road had ended, but the unsettling feeling remained. I glanced back toward the wooded stretch, half expecting to see the figures reappear or the 13th tree beckoning me back. I drove the remaining miles in silence, the rain continuing to beat against the truck's roof. The legends of Hot Rod Haven were now more than just stories to me. They were a haunting reality. The combination of fear and curiosity had led me down that road, and what I encountered had left a lasting impression. As I finally arrived home, the night's events replayed in my mind. Hot Rod Haven had lived up to its reputation, blending the boundaries between legend and reality. The fear I felt was genuine, and the sight of those figures would stay with me for a long time. The road's legends had proven themselves to be more than mere tales. They had become a part of my own story. The night had been filled with horror stories, scary tales, and a true test of courage. The rain's constant drumming and the unsettling atmosphere of Hot Rod Haven would forever be etched into my memory. A chilling reminder of the road that ends with a drop-off into the unknown. I'd never planned on visiting Waverly Hills Sanatorium, especially not on Halloween night, but when my friends dared me to check out the old place, I figured it was a chance to prove my mettle. The drive to Louisville took longer than expected, with the rain pouring down like someone was dumping buckets from the sky. By the time I got to the base of the hill where the sanatorium stood, the evening had turned dark and eerie. Waverly Hills was a massive, crumbling structure that looked like it had stepped right out of a nightmare. It was already eerie enough with its history of illness and death, but now, with it being used as a haunted house for Halloween, the place was even more unsettling. The dim lights cast long shadows across the rotting walls, and the sound of rain tapping against the windows created a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. The legends about the place were unsettling, to say the least. The top floor was rumored to be haunted by a nurse who had taken her own life, driven to despair by rumors of her pregnancy. The body chute, a grim reminder of how the dead were hidden from the living, loomed in the background. This history made the entire hill feel charged with a dark, oppressive energy. I made my way up the steep driveway, the headlights cutting through the mist that clung to the road. Just as I was beginning to doubt my decision, I saw the silhouette of a small trailer beside the sanatorium. I'd heard about the old groundskeeper who used to live there, a man who had 3 dogs that patrolled the property. According to the stories, those dogs were now possessed by restless spirits. I parked my truck and grabbed my flashlight. The ground was slick with rain, making every step a cautious one. As I walked toward the sanatorium, the distant howling of dogs cut through the steady drum of the rain. It was the kind of sound that made you question your sanity. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Stepping into the sanatorium was like walking into a different era. The air inside was stale and cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and doesn't let go. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper and broken tiles. Every creak of the old building seemed magnified in the silence. It was clear why this place had earned its reputation as one of the scariest places around. As I ventured deeper into the sanatorium, I heard the distant echoing sounds of what seemed like footsteps. I froze, straining to listen over the rain drumming on the roof. The footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by the unsettling silence of the building. I pressed on, my flashlight's beam flickering as if it too was unnerved by the surroundings. My path led me to the infamous body chute. I could see the sloped concrete meant for the deceased, the gradient so steep that it looked like a slide. The idea of bodies sliding down this chute while the living walked alongside them was chilling. I shivered, trying to push away the grotesque imagery that my mind conjured up. Suddenly I heard a low growl behind me. Spinning around, I saw 3 dogs emerge from the shadows. They were white, their eyes glowing a sinister red. The growls became louder and more aggressive as they approached. My heart raced, and I took a step back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. These were the dogs from the legend's dogs that had been possessed, and now hunted anyone who dared to come near. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the wet floor. The dogs' barks echoed through the empty halls, getting closer with every passing second. I could feel their presence behind me, a palpable terror that made it hard to breathe. I sprinted through the darkened corridors, the sound of the rain mingling with the frantic barking. The dogs' barks were relentless, each one cutting through the stillness like a knife. My flashlight bobbed wildly as I ran, illuminating the crumbling walls and casting long, jittery shadows. The sheer terror of the chase pushed me forward, my mind racing with a singular focus: escape. I skidded around a corner and stumbled into what looked like an old operating room. The surgical tables were rusted and covered in a thick layer of dust. The room felt like a mausoleum, with remnants of the past scattered across the floor. The growling of the dogs grew louder, reverberating off the walls and making it clear they were closing in on me. Breathing heavily, I ducked behind a broken cabinet, trying to muffle my ragged breaths. The dogs' red eyes glowed ominously in the dark, their growls punctuated by the sound of their claws scraping against the floor. I could see their shadows moving past the cracked doorway. I was trapped, with nowhere to go but forward. I waited for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, until the growls began to fade. It seemed the dogs had moved on, or perhaps they were circling the building, waiting for me to make a mistake. I slowly peered out from my hiding spot, my eyes scanning the darkened corridor for any sign of movement. Taking a deep breath, I crept out and continued my escape. The sound of the rain outside was a welcome relief compared to the relentless growls. As I made my way back to the exit, I could hear the eerie whispers of the sanatoriums past echoes of the patients who once roamed these halls. The haunting atmosphere was nearly as terrifying as the possessed dogs that had chased me. I finally reached the exit, pushing open the heavy door and stepping out into the cold, rainy night. My heart was still racing and my clothes were drenched, but I felt a rush of relief to be outside. The storm seemed to have intensified, the rain falling harder and the wind howling like a banshee. I looked back at the sanatorium, its shadowy form looming ominously against the stormy sky. As I made my way back to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The dog's red eyes haunted my thoughts, and the growls echoed in my mind. I reached my vehicle, fumbled with the keys, and finally got inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I glanced at the sanatorium one last time, but the rain made it hard to see clearly. The oppressive weight of the night seemed to lift slightly, but the memory of the chase was fresh in my mind. Driving away, I couldn't help but reflect on what I had experienced. The stories about the possessed dogs and the haunted top floor were more than just tales. They had felt all too real. The terror I felt was palpable, a visceral reminder of how the past can linger and affect the present. The rain continued to pour, the sound of it a constant reminder of the night's events. As I reached the outskirts of town, I finally began to calm down. The adrenaline that had fueled my escape was starting to wear off, replaced by a deep sense of exhaustion. I knew I wouldn't be forgetting this night anytime soon. The experience at Waverly Hills had been more than just a scary story. It was a reminder of the thin veil that separates us from the unknown. The sanatorium faded into the distance, but its presence remained with me. The rain-slicked road ahead was a welcome sight, a path back to the normal world. The echoes of Waverly Hills would linger in my memory, a chilling reminder of the dark stories that can become all too real. I had just finished my shift at the truck stop and was heading home. The roads were eerily quiet, save for the occasional splash of rain on the windshield. I'd heard the local legends about Pope Lick Creek and the Goat Man, but they always seemed like exaggerated tales meant to scare people away. Tonight, however, I felt a strange pull to drive past those infamous tracks. It was probably the heavy rain and the lonely stretch of road that drew me in. Little did I know the night was about to turn into one of those true horror stories I'd heard about. The area around Pope Lick Creek is pretty desolate, and with the weather being as grim as it was, visibility was nearly zero. I could barely see the lines on the road, and the only sounds were the rain beating down and the steady hum of the truck's engine. As I approached the bridge, the stories about people falling to their death seemed even more plausible. The bridge itself was an old, creaky structure, and the thought of it collapsing underfoot was unsettling. I parked the truck a safe distance away and grabbed a flashlight, more out of habit than necessity. The light cut through the darkness, revealing the tracks that ran parallel to the creek. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and there was a strange stillness to the night. My curiosity was getting the better of me, so I decided to walk down the tracks just to see if there was anything to the legends. As I walked along the rails, I could hear the distant rumble of what I thought might be a train. The sound was faint, like a memory of a train passing by, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me. The more I walked, the more I felt as though something was wrong. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown, but something deeper, an instinct telling me to turn back. Suddenly I noticed what looked like fresh animal tracks leading off the tracks and into the woods. The ground was disturbed, and I saw a few scattered bones, which only added to the eeriness of the night. The rain started to fall harder, and I could barely hear anything over the downpour. I wasn't sure what to make of the tracks or the bones. Could they be linked to the monster, or was it just a part of the wilderness? The combination of rain and darkness was making everything seem far more sinister than it probably was. The rain didn't let up as I continued along the tracks, each step feeling heavier than the last. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. The myths about the Pope-Lick monster seemed to blur with the reality of my situation. I kept reminding myself that these were just stories, scary stories meant to entertain, not to scare someone in reality. But the more I walked, the more those stories began to feel like a real possibility. As I reached the midpoint of the bridge, a strange, almost ghostly light flickered in the distance. It wasn't the sort of light that came from a car or a normal source. It was more like a faint, eerie glow moving steadily along the tracks. My first thought was that it was a train coming, but the light didn't grow closer or brighter. It remained a steady, unsettling presence in the darkness. I tried to dismiss the light as a trick of the rain, but then I heard something that made my heart race, a distant scream. It was a chilling, heart-wrenching sound, almost like someone was in severe distress. The scream seemed to come from the same direction as the light. I froze, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but all I could see was the unrelenting rain and the dim light. The rain seemed to intensify, pounding down with such force that it felt like it might wash everything away. My flashlight flickered as if it was struggling against the elements, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I took a few more steps forward, driven by a mix of curiosity and fear. The thought of the boy from the stories, trapped on the tracks, came rushing back to me. Was this some kind of twisted reenactment of the legend? Suddenly, the light grew dimmer, and the screaming stopped. I was left standing in a heavy silence, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly missed something that might have been more than just a ghost story. With every minute that passed, I became more convinced that this was a night I wouldn't easily forget. The air was thick with tension as I turned back toward the truck. I was drenched and chilled to the bone, but the sense of foreboding was more disconcerting than the weather. My thoughts raced as I tried to rationalize what I'd just experienced. The eerie light and the distressing scream could have been explained away by the storm, or my own overactive imagination. But something about the night made me doubt my own explanations. As I made my way back to the truck, I noticed something peculiar, an old rusted sign on the side of the road. It was partially obscured by the rain and overgrown vegetation, but the faded letters seemed to spell out a warning about the dangers of the tracks. This sign was so old it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I took a closer look, trying to make sense of it. It seemed like a relic from a time when people took the warnings more seriously. The rain started to ease, but the damage had already been done. I climbed into the truck, feeling a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. My hands were shaking as I tried to start the engine, and the cold made every sound outside seem amplified. The distant rumble I had heard earlier was now unmistakably the sound of a train. It was faint, but there was no mistaking the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks. I didn't see a train, but the sound and the way it seemed to echo through the night made me uneasy. I glanced at the bridge one last time, half expecting to see something or someone standing on it, but the bridge was empty, and the only movement was the occasional drop of water cascading from the overhang. I drove away from the area, my mind racing with questions and fears. The stories had seemed like mere legends before, but tonight's events had blurred the lines between myth and reality, whether it was a psychological effect or something more. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been a part of something much bigger than myself. I drove away from the bridge with my nerves still on edge, trying to make sense of the night's events. The eerie light, the ghostly scream, and the old sign all played on a loop in my mind. I couldn't ignore the nagging thought that I had been part of something significant, something more than just a night of fright. The stories about the Pope Lick monster and the phantom train had taken on a new, unsettling reality for me. As the truck rolled down the road, I noticed a pair of headlights approaching in the distance. A vehicle pulled up beside me, and the driver gave me a nod. I recognized the face. It was someone I'd seen in town before. They had that familiar look of someone who had heard the same legends but had never quite believed them. The driver rolled down their window. "Rough night?" they asked, their tone casual, but with a hint of curiosity. I hesitated before responding. "You could say that. Did you hear or see anything strange around the bridge?" The driver's expression turned serious. "I've heard stories, but I've never seen anything. Some people say the ghost train is just a way to scare people away from dangerous spots. Others believe it's a warning. Either way, it's best to stay clear of the tracks." Their words struck a chord with me. I realized that whether or not the supernatural elements were true, the danger was very real. The stories were rooted in the very real risk of getting hurt, or worse, if people weren't careful. The sense of unease I felt was grounded in a tangible fear of the unknown. I thanked the driver and watched as they drove off, their taillights fading into the night. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, and the eerie calmness that followed made me reflect on the night's events. I had been drawn to the tracks by curiosity and the thrill of a legend, but I was leaving with a new respect for the real dangers that lay in dark, forgotten places. As I drove back towards town, I realized that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that hit closest to home. The Pope Lick phantom might have been more legend than reality, but the fear and respect it inspired were very real. I understood now that legends, no matter how frightening, often carry with them a kernel of truth that should not be ignored. The night had been a vivid reminder that not all horrors are confined to fiction. Some are deeply embedded in the very places we dare to explore. I drove on, the rain gently pattering against the windshield, knowing that I would never quite look at the stories or the tracks the same way again. Driving through Blood Alley has always been a tense experience. The two-lane road snaking from Wickenburg to Kingman, Arizona, is notorious for its blind curves and lack of cell phone reception. The highway, flanked by small white crosses marking tragic accidents, has earned its grim nickname due to the sheer number of fatalities that have occurred along its length. The crosses, some in clusters, tell stories of families and individuals whose lives were cut short by the road's unforgiving nature. It was one night in the early 1990s when I experienced something that would haunt me for years. My spouse and I, along with my brother and his partner, were returning from a family reunion in Las Vegas. We had left the city late, around 2 or 3 in the morning. Our pickup truck was having engine issues, so we decided it would be best to drive ahead with my brother following us. That way, if our truck broke down, we'd have a backup plan. Little did we know, this decision would lead to an unforgettable night. The stars were exceptionally bright that night, casting an eerie glow over the road. The moon hung high, providing just enough light to reveal the crosses dotting the highway. I glanced back to check on my brother's vehicle, noting he was still about half a mile behind us. When I faced forward again, I noticed a small, flickering light ahead. It resembled a flashlight at first, and I mentioned it to my spouse, wondering if someone might be stranded or in need of help. As we approached, the light became clearer, looking more like an old-fashioned lantern. Why would someone be camping so close to the road? I mused aloud, perplexed by the sight. My spouse agreed, noting how odd it was. We slowed down, concerned that someone might need assistance. The lantern's glow grew brighter, and as we drew closer, The figure of a man emerged from the shadows. He was tall, dressed in black jeans and a long duster, with a cowboy hat pulled low over his face. He held the lantern in front of him, revealing a vintage black Harley parked nearby. Just as we passed the man, he took a step back into the darkness, and the lantern's light vanished instantly. My heart raced. I turned around, shouting for my spouse to stop, but he was adamant about not pulling over. "I'm not stopping," he yelled. "I don't care who that was." The road was empty, and my brother's vehicle was nowhere to be seen. Panic set in as we searched for a place to turn around, convinced something had gone terribly wrong. When we finally reconnected with my brother's vehicle, we all parked at a McDonald's in Wickenburg. We were eager to discuss what we had seen. My brother and his partner described a similar experience, confirming they had seen the same lantern and man and the old Harley. The consistency of our stories was chilling. Despite our attempts to uncover more about that night, the details remained elusive. We dubbed the encounter the Highwayman, and the memory of that eerie night continues to unsettle me, even now. The drive to Phoenix felt interminable that night. Even though it was a relatively short trip, the hour we spent calming down seemed to stretch on forever. The eerie encounter with the lantern-bearing man lingered in our minds, casting a shadow over the remainder of our journey. Every creak of the truck, every gust of wind, seemed to whisper reminders of that unsettling experience. The conversation in the truck was a mix of bewilderment and apprehension. We each tried to piece together the encounter, comparing notes and dissecting every detail. The man's sudden appearance and disappearance, the dimming lantern, and the vintage Harley. It was as if the entire incident was plucked from a ghost story. Yet, it was undeniably real, experienced by all of us in exactly the same way. The next day, I tried to put the encounter behind me. The sun's warmth and the bustling activity of Phoenix helped to dispel some of the lingering fear. We recounted the events to friends and family, but their reactions ranged from skepticism to curiosity. It was as if the encounter was too surreal to fully grasp, and it remained a topic of hushed conversations and uneasy laughter. I spent some time researching the history of Blood Alley, hoping to find an explanation for what we saw. Articles about the highway were filled with stories of tragic accidents, but none mentioned a mysterious figure or an old Harley. The small white crosses were stark reminders of the road's deadly reputation, but there were no records of a man matching the description we had seen. It was as if the highwayman was a phantom, an enigma with no past or explanation. The memory of that night stayed with me, resurfacing during quiet moments when I least expected it. The fear I felt driving through that desolate stretch of road was a visceral reminder of our encounter. I often found myself replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of them. Despite my efforts, the image of the lantern and the shadowy figure remained as haunting as ever. Months later, as I drove along a different route, I found myself reflecting on Blood Alley and the highwayman, the desolate road, the tragic accidents, and our own eerie experience created a tapestry of unsettling memories. I still felt a chill when I thought about the man with the lantern, and I wondered if others had experienced something similar. The road to Phoenix was familiar, but the lingering unease from that night had changed the way I viewed the journey. Blood Alley had become more than just a stretch of highway. It was a place where reality and fear intertwined, creating an experience that defied easy explanation. As the months passed, the unsettling experience on Blood Alley remained a vivid and unsettling chapter in our lives. Although we had moved on, the memory of that night often resurfaced, particularly during long, solitary drives. The highway's chilling aura seemed to have etched itself into our collective consciousness, a ghostly remnant of a real experience that defied rational explanation. One evening, a few years later, I found myself driving alone on a desolate stretch of highway in a different part of Arizona. The road was similar to Blood Alley, narrow, winding, and devoid of any substantial roadside infrastructure. It was a quiet night, the kind where the only sounds were the gentle hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind against the vehicle. The moonlight cast eerie shadows on the road, enhancing the feeling of isolation. As I navigated the curves, I couldn't shake the sense of déjà vu. The road, the darkness, and the oppressive quiet reminded me of that fateful night on Blood Alley. My mind drifted back to the highwayman, the enigmatic figure with the lantern, and I found myself wondering if other drivers had shared similar experiences. The road stretched on with not a single vehicle in sight. I kept my eyes on the road, but my thoughts were preoccupied with the memory of that night. The headlights of my car cut through the darkness, and every turn and rise seemed to magnify the quiet tension that lingered in the back of my mind. Suddenly, a light appeared in the distance. It was faint at first, much like the lantern we had seen years ago. My heart skipped a beat as the light grew brighter, and I found myself instinctively slowing down. The air in the car seemed to thicken, and the memory of the highwayman became more vivid. I squinted into the distance, trying to discern what the light was. As I got closer, it began to resemble a vehicle's headlights, but something about the way it flickered made me uneasy. As I approached, the light seemed to dissolve into the shadows, leaving me with nothing but the empty road ahead. My anxiety spiked, and I pulled over to the side, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I waited, half expecting to see something or someone emerge from the darkness. The minutes dragged on, and the only sounds were the distant hum of the wind and the occasional creak of my vehicle. After a while, I gathered the courage to continue driving. The light never reappeared, and the road remained eerily quiet. I resumed my journey, but the sense of unease never fully dissipated. It was as if the darkness itself was hiding something just beyond the edge of my vision. The experience left me with more questions than answers. Was it merely a trick of the light, or a figment of my imagination, heightened by the memories of Blood Alley? Or was it something more sinister, a continuation of the unsettling encounter from years ago? When I finally reached my destination, I tried to shake off the lingering fear. I shared my experience with friends, but their reactions were mixed. Some were intrigued, while others dismissed it as an overactive imagination. The encounter remained a personal mystery, one that added another layer to the already chilling narrative of Blood Alley. The road had taken on a new dimension for me, not just a path from one place to another, but a place where the echoes of past experiences seemed to linger in the shadows. Each trip, each lonely stretch of highway, held the potential for new, unsettling encounters, a reminder that some roads carry more than just physical distance. Years later, the chilling memory of Blood Alley and the mysterious highwayman had become a dark legend in my family's lore. Despite the passage of time, the experience had left an indelible mark, transforming a simple highway into a site of ominous whispers and unsettling memories. Yet, the road had also become a place of contemplation, a space where the past and present seemed to merge in haunting ways. One summer night, I found myself driving along a new stretch of highway that had recently opened, a route intended to bypass some of the treacherous roads that had plagued travelers in the past. It was a clear evening, with the moon casting a soft, reassuring glow over the landscape. The new highway was a stark contrast to Blood Alley, smooth, well-lit, and expansive. Yet, as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still connected to that unsettling night years ago. The highway stretched before me, lined with the occasional tree and illuminated by streetlights. The contrast between this road and the narrow, winding Blood Alley was striking. However, the sensation of unease persisted, as though some of the old fears had traveled with me, adapting to the new environment. As I drove, my thoughts turned to the stories and legends surrounding Blood Alley, particularly the tragic accident involving the family of 6. Despite my attempts to rationalize the experience, the image of the 6 white crosses remained vivid in my mind. It was as if those crosses had become symbols of a deeper, more profound sense of foreboding that I couldn't fully comprehend. The new highway had been designed to avoid the treacherous areas that had earned its predecessor its grim reputation. However, as I drove, I noticed a series of small white markers along the roadside, seemingly innocuous but eerily reminiscent of the crosses on Blood Alley. My curiosity was piqued, and I slowed down, observing the markers with a mix of fascination and apprehension. My journey took me past several of these markers, each one standing solitary against the backdrop of the night. The sight of them, while not as somber as the crosses on Blood Alley, stirred a sense of déjà vu. The markers seemed to be an echo of the past, a reminder of the road's history despite its new, seemingly safer facade. As I continued along the highway, I began to notice a pattern. The markers appeared to be placed at intervals, and the more I drove, the more frequently I saw them. It was almost as if they were guiding me or warning me, a subtle reminder of the road's history that I couldn't ignore. Eventually, the markers disappeared, and I found myself back on a more familiar stretch of road, one that led me to my destination. The sense of unease I had felt earlier had not entirely dissipated, but it had been tempered by the reassurance of the well-lit, modern highway. Yet, the echoes of the past, those haunting memories of Blood Alley and the highwayman, continued to linger in the back of my mind. As I arrived at my destination, I reflected on the experience. The new highway, despite its improvements, had connected me to the past in unexpected ways. The markers, while not as ominous as the crosses, had served as a bridge between the old and new, a reminder that even as we move forward, the echoes of our past experiences continue to shape our perceptions. The legend of Blood Alley had become more than just a story. It had become a part of my personal narrative, woven into the fabric of my travels. Each road I traveled, each marker I passed, seemed to hold a fragment of that haunting night, a reminder that some experiences are never truly left behind. As the years passed, the haunting experiences along Blood Alley remained a vivid chapter in my life, but they had also become a reflection of a deeper, more personal journey. The story of that night of the highwayman and the eerie lantern had become more than just a chilling tale. It had evolved into a profound lesson about the way we confront and understand fear. The new highway, with its bright lights and smooth pavement, was a stark contrast to the narrow, winding Blood Alley. Yet, it was a testament to how we often attempt to distance ourselves from our fears by creating new paths and improvements. Despite these efforts, the echoes of the past seem to linger, reminding us that some experiences shape us in ways we may not always fully understand. I often think about the night we encountered the highwayman and the subsequent drive along the new highway. The markers I saw that night were a haunting reminder that the past doesn't disappear, it adapts and integrates into our present. They served as a bridge between the old and the new, a reflection of how we navigate our fears and experiences. In the quiet moments of reflection, I find myself revisiting that night with a sense of gratitude. The experience, while terrifying, had brought my family and me closer together. It had reinforced our resilience and our ability to face the unknown, even when it seemed insurmountable. The story of Blood Alley and the highwayman had become a part of our family lore, a tale passed down through generations as a reminder of the fragility and strength of human experience. It was a narrative that illustrated the enduring impact of our encounters with the unknown and the way they shape our understanding of the world around us. In sharing this story, I hope to offer a glimpse into the nature of fear and resilience. It is not just about the supernatural or the eerie. It is about how we confront and process our experiences, how we find meaning in the chaos, and how we ultimately navigate the paths we travel. The highway, both old and new, serves as a metaphor for this journey, a reminder that even as we forge ahead, the past remains an integral part of who we are. As I look back on that night and the years that followed, I am reminded that our stories, whether they are filled with fear, hope, or simply the mundane, are all a part of the human experience. They shape us, challenge us, and ultimately define our path forward. And in this way, the legend of Blood Alley and the highwayman will always remain a part of my personal narrative, a testament to the enduring power of stories and the ways they reflect our deepest fears and hopes. It was late November when I found myself navigating the old Highway 666 in New Mexico. It had been years since they renamed it, but to me it would always be Highway 666. The sun had long disappeared, leaving only the cold glow of the full moon to illuminate the road ahead. I remember feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, just a nagging sense of unease. I'd driven this stretch of road plenty of times before, and though ID heard the stories, ID always managed to get through without incident. The highway was deserted, the kind of desolation that makes you realize just how isolated you are. There were no rest areas, No houses, just endless stretches of asphalt cutting through the barren landscape. My truck's headlights sliced through the darkness, and the only sounds were the steady hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the wind. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the stories that whispered through my mind like the shadows dancing on the edges of my vision. A truck passed me in the opposite direction, its lights briefly illuminating the interior of my cab. It was one of the few vehicles I'd seen all night. I glanced at the fuel gauge. It was getting low, but I figured I had enough to make it to the next town. I hoped I wouldn't need to rely on another trucker for help if I broke down out here. The thought made me shiver, not because of the cold, but because of the stories I'd heard about the kinds of truckers who roamed these roads. As I drove on, the moonlight flickered through the clouds, casting eerie shadows on the road. The desolate stretch was known for strange occurrences. I had heard about the ghostly muscle car that supposedly followed drivers, and the stories about hitchhikers who vanished into thin air. I wasn't sure if I believed them, but they certainly made the long drives seem more sinister. I kept my mind occupied by focusing on the road and the sound of rain pattering on the windshield, hoping it would drown out the creeping sense of dread. Just as I was starting to relax, I noticed a car in my rearview mirror. It was a vintage muscle car, its headlights glaring through the foggy night. It seemed to be following me, keeping a steady distance. I tried to shake it off by speeding up, but the car stayed right behind me, never overtaking. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. I tried to concentrate on the road, but the image of that car remained in my mind, a constant, unnerving presence. The muscle car was still behind me as I continued down the highway, its headlights a relentless glare in my mirrors. I kept my speed steady, trying not to let my nerves get the best of me. The stories about this road had always been unsettling, but now they felt too close to reality. I could almost hear the whispers of the legends, like the eerie rain sounds tapping against my windshield. Every so often I glanced in the rearview mirror. The car was always there, just close enough to make me uncomfortable, but never close enough to catch. I tried changing lanes, hoping to lose it, but it mirrored my moves. The tension in my cab was palpable. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles turning white. I knew I had to stay focused. The road ahead was as desolate as ever, and I had to make it through without any more distractions. The headlights of the muscle car seemed to grow more intense, almost like they were bearing down on me, adding to my anxiety. The road stretched on endlessly, a dark ribbon in the middle of nowhere, with no signs of civilization. The rain was starting to pick up, drumming heavily on the roof of my truck. It was as if the storm was trying to drown out my thoughts, or perhaps it was just adding to the unsettling atmosphere. I could barely hear the engine over the sound of the rain. It felt like the highway itself was closing in on me, and the muscle car's persistent presence was just one more thing to worry about. As I drove, I kept my eyes fixed on the road, but the shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision. I could feel my heart racing, a constant reminder of the fear that had settled in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild, but the car was still there, a dark omen in the rearview mirror. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity as I hoped for the end of this haunted stretch. By now, the rain was pouring down in torrents, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in front of me. The muscle car was still tailing me, its headlights like twin spotlights piercing through the storm. Every so often, lightning illuminated the road, casting brief, flickering shadows that seemed to dance around my truck. My anxiety was through the roof, and every squeal of the tires on the wet pavement made my heart skip a beat. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, trying to gauge the distance between us. The car was still close enough to make my skin crawl, but I couldn't shake it no matter how fast I drove. I could hear the rain pounding harder against the roof, as if the storm was trying to drown out my thoughts and fears. The highway felt like it was closing in on me, each mile stretching into what felt like an eternity. In the midst of my growing panic, I noticed something strange. The muscle car's headlights seemed to flicker and dim, as if it was struggling to keep up. I wasn't sure if it was my nerves playing tricks on me, or if something else was going on. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing thoughts. Maybe I was just exhausted and imagining things. Suddenly, The headlights of the muscle car disappeared entirely, leaving me in almost complete darkness. I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. I slowed down, trying to see if the car had fallen back, or if it had vanished completely. Just as I began to relax, I saw a figure up ahead in the middle of the road, a young woman standing there, drenched from the rain, her clothes clinging to her body. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the wet road. The woman looked up at me, her face obscured by the rain and darkness. I couldn't tell if she was real or a part of some twisted hallucination brought on by my fear and exhaustion. My heart was pounding as I watched her, unsure of what to do next. The woman remained in the road, drenched and motionless, as I struggled to regain my composure. The rain continued to beat down relentlessly, adding to the sense of urgency. My headlights barely cut through the downpour, casting a dim glow around her. I could see her face more clearly, now pale, with a look of distress frozen in time. She seemed almost translucent, like a ghost caught between worlds. I hesitated, wondering if I should get out and check on her or drive past. My instinct screamed at me to help, but every nerve in my body was telling me to get out of there. The stories about Highway 666 had always mentioned ghostly hitchhikers, and now one seemed to be right in front of me. I had no idea if she was real, or if this was some kind of elaborate trick played by my mind. The muscle car was nowhere in sight anymore, which only added to the eerie feeling. Summoning my courage, I opened the truck door and stepped out into the rain. The cold water hit me immediately, but I pushed through, walking cautiously toward the woman. As I got closer, she turned her head slightly, and I could see the vacant look in her eyes. She didn't move or speak, just stood there as if waiting for something. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the storm. There was no response. I reached out a hand to touch her shoulder, and as soon as my fingers made contact, she seemed to dissolve into the rain, her form vanishing as if it was never there. I stood there, soaked to the bone, staring at the empty road where she had been. The experience left me shaken. I got back into the truck, my hands trembling as I started the engine. The rest of the drive felt like a blur, with the rain finally easing as I approached the end of Highway 666. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something beyond explanation, something that fit right into the horror stories of this desolate road. As I finally left the highway behind, I felt a sense of relief mixed with a haunting unease. The memories of that night would stay with me, a chilling reminder of the legends that live on in the dark stretches of Highway 666. It was a warm summer evening in 2002, and I was driving a big rig loaded up and ready to go from Gallup, New Mexico, to Florence, Arizona. Highway 666 was notorious, but it was the quickest route, and I'd driven it more times than I could count. The clock read 3:00 a.m. A nice night to drive, clear skies and no rain in sight. The road stretched out before me, and I settled into the rhythm of the drive, the hum of the engine a constant companion. As I made my way through the Four Corners area, something odd happened. I had just rounded a bend when a sudden chill filled the cab. The temperature dropped as if the AC had been cranked up to the max, even though I hadn't touched the controls. My breath misted slightly in front of me, and an eerie sensation crawled up my spine. I glanced over at the empty passenger seat, half expecting to see someone sitting there, but it was just as empty as ever. The cold lasted only a minute, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I chalked it up to a trick of the night, maybe a draft from an open window or something. When I pulled into the truck stop down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling. I grabbed a coffee and chatted with some fellow drivers. I casually asked, "Ever come over the hill and hit a cold spot?" Some shrugged and said they had experienced the same thing, though they didn't think much of it. I mentioned it to the truck stop owner, hoping for some insight. He nodded slowly and told me a story that made my blood run cold. Apparently, back when this highway was still a new route for truckers, a driver had gone off the side of the ridge and was never found. Locals believe that his spirit now rides along with truckers, ensuring they pass safely through that cursed section of the road. The idea of a spectral hitchhiker wasn't comforting, and I had no desire to test that theory. Since then, I've driven that route numerous times. Each time I passed that stretch of road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It's been a few years since they renamed the highway US 393, but old signs still hang below the new ones. Every time I see them, I remember the cold spot and the eerie story attached to it. The summer of 2003 was hot, but that night the air was unnervingly cool as I made my way back down Highway 666, now US 393. I had just finished another long haul and was heading back to Gallup. The sun had long set, and the darkness seemed to swallow up the road ahead. Despite the heat during the day, the night was crisp, and the chill from the previous year lingered in my mind. As I approached the same stretch of highway where I'd felt that icy presence before, I braced myself. The memories of the cold spot from last year had stayed with me, and I wondered if it would happen again. The road stretched out before me, illuminated by the headlights, but the familiar sensation of unease began to creep in. As I neared the section of road where the legend had taken root, the temperature in the cab began to drop. Just as it had before, my breath fogged up the air, and the cold seemed to seep through the walls of the truck. I glanced over at the passenger seat, half expecting to see a ghostly figure sitting there, but the seat remained empty. I couldn't shake the feeling of someone or something riding alongside me. I tightened my grip on the wheel and kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, determined not to let my nerves get the best of me. Suddenly, my radio crackled to life, and the voice of another trucker came through. "Hey, you feel that?" he asked. "Just past that cold spot. Creepy as hell." I wasn't alone in feeling it. The realization brought some comfort but also heightened my anxiety. I replied, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, I felt it too. It's like the temperature just drops out of nowhere." When I finally reached the end of that stretch of road, the chill began to fade, and the temperature returned to normal. I pulled into the truck stop, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering unease. I shared my experience with a few fellow drivers who gathered around. They nodded knowingly, some sharing their own eerie tales of cold spots and strange sensations. It was clear that this was more than just a fluke. I spent the rest of the night trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The stories and experiences of other drivers only deepened the mystery surrounding that stretch of road. As I settled into my cab for a few hours of rest, I couldn't help but wonder about the truth behind the legend of Highway 666. The next few months were routine, with the occasional cold spot on Highway 666, now US 393. By the fall of 2003, I had driven that route so many times that it was almost second nature. The chill was no longer a surprise, but rather an unsettling part of the journey. It was another warm evening in late October when I found myself headed eastbound, my load destined for a delivery in Florence. The night was clear, but a faint fog rolled in, adding an extra layer of mystery to the already eerie road. As I neared the notorious section, the familiar drop in temperature swept through the cab. Like a sudden blast of icy air, my truck seemed to shiver, and I felt the cold creep over me just as it had before. I glanced at the empty passenger seat, my thoughts drifting to the ghostly legend. This time, I was determined to keep my cool. The radio crackled with the usual chatter from fellow truckers, and I heard one of them mention a particularly cold spot ahead. It seemed everyone who had traveled this route had their own stories of unexplained chills and eerie experiences. The collective knowledge of these experiences made me feel less isolated in my unease, but also more aware of the legend's grip on our minds. The fog thickened as I drove through the area, and the feeling of being accompanied by an unseen presence grew stronger. The cold was so intense that I could see my breath clearly, and the lights from my truck cast long, distorted shadows across the road. The sensation of not being alone was palpable, and I kept expecting to see a figure in the shadows or the faint outline of someone in the passenger seat. When I finally reached the end of the cold stretch, the temperature slowly returned to normal, but the feeling of dread lingered. I pulled into a rest area just off the highway and parked my rig. The fog was still thick outside, and the occasional gust of wind made the shadows dance. As I stepped out of the truck, I noticed several other drivers parked nearby, each with their own stories to share. We talked about our experiences with the cold spots and the ghostly legend, and I couldn't help but feel that the legend had become a part of my own journey. That night, as I tried to sleep, the chill of the road seemed to follow me into my dreams. The legend of Highway 666 had become more than just a story. It was an experience I had come to expect, a part of my travels that I couldn't escape. And though the cold spots were unsettling, they were now a reminder of the eerie history of the road. It was the last night of my run before taking a break, and I was driving along US 393, the road that had become so familiar over the past years. The air was warmer than usual for late November, but the night held an unsettling quiet. As I approached the same stretch where I had encountered the cold spots before, a sense of foreboding settled over me. It felt like I was heading into the heart of the legend that had haunted my travels. The temperature in the cab began to drop abruptly, and the familiar icy chill returned. My breath misted in the air, and I could almost sense the presence beside me again. The radio buzzed with static, and then a voice came through, but the message was garbled and incoherent. I couldn't make out the words, and the radio soon fell silent. It was as if the road itself was trying to communicate something, though what, I couldn't say. As I drove through the foggy section, the shadows seemed to elongate and twist in the dim light of my headlights. The road felt endless, and every turn seemed to stretch out longer than it should. I kept glancing at the passenger seat, half expecting to see someone or something there, but the seat remained empty, the chill my only companion. The fog grew denser, and I struggled to see beyond the immediate area around the truck. The cold was almost unbearable, and it felt like time had slowed down. I could feel my pulse quicken, and every sound seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. The cold spot seemed to be the center of the highway's mystery, and it was as if the road itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When I finally reached the end of the stretch, the fog began to lift, and the temperature returned to normal. I parked at a truck stop and took a moment to gather myself. As I walked into the diner, I saw several other drivers, each sharing their own tales of eerie encounters and cold spots. It was clear that the legend of Highway 666 had left its mark on many. That night, as I rested, the cold spot seemed to have left a lingering impression on me. It wasn't just a chill in the air, it was a reminder of the road's haunting past and the stories it held. The legend of Highway 666, now US 393, had become a part of my own journey, an unsettling but unforgettable aspect of my travels. It was 1994, and I was driving my family through the heart of New Mexico. We were on our way to Socorro to visit my ex-wife's grandmother, who was gravely ill with lung cancer. The trip was somber, a mix of sadness and resignation hanging in the air. With my ex-wife, our 4 kids, her sister, and my brother-in-law packed into our van, we set out from Albuquerque. On the way, we stopped by my sister-in-law's house. The street it was on had a charming church with a beautiful, tranquil aura. The peacefulness of the place was striking, almost as if the church was untouched by the harshness of reality. After visiting my sister-in-law, we proceeded to her grandmother's house. It was a heartfelt but melancholic visit, underscoring the gravity of the situation. With the evening approaching, we decided to grab a bite to eat. My wife, her sister, my brother-in-law, and the kids piled into the van again. As night fell, someone suggested we find a house rumored to be owned by Sybil North, allegedly a local witch. I wasn't thrilled about the idea. Something about it made my skin crawl, but with everyone eager to go, I reluctantly agreed. After dinner, we began our search for Sybil North's house. The town of Socorro isn't very large, but I was unfamiliar with it. We ended up driving through dark streets devoid of street lights, which only heightened my unease. The road we were on seemed endless, and my anxiety grew with every mile. Eventually, we reached a cul-de-sac surrounded by darkness. No streetlights, no houses, just the cold, empty expanse. The tension in the van was palpable as I suggested we turn back. But just then, headlights appeared down the road, the only car in sight. As it approached, I recognized it as my sister-in-law's vehicle. I was puzzled and uneasy as she pulled up next to us. When my sister-in-law's car pulled up beside us, it was a jarring sight against the dark backdrop. Her unexpected appearance in that isolated spot seemed almost otherworldly. We asked her how she managed to find us in such a remote area. She replied that something had compelled her, a feeling that guided her to us because we were lost. Her explanation sounded peculiar and unsettling. She mentioned knowing exactly where Sybil North's house was, pointing us in the right direction. We followed her instructions, driving up a hill and into an even darker area. At the top of the hill, she guided us to a house that matched the rumors of Sybil North's dwelling. It looked like a classic depiction of a witch's house, an unkempt yard, peeling paint, and a dim light glowing from within. The place was eerie, standing out starkly from the well-kept homes around it. As we drove past the house, I suggested we leave immediately. The discomfort I felt was growing, but as we reached the main road, something strange happened. The headlights on my van started flickering on and off. It was an unsettling sight, especially since I was a diesel mechanic and knew vehicles inside and out. I pulled over to check the wiring and connections, but everything seemed intact. The flickering lights only added to the growing tension among us. My family was visibly frightened, and the weird coincidence of the lights malfunctioning after seeing Sybil North's house did nothing to calm their nerves. The strange occurrence continued as we drove, and I could hear an odd noise coming from one of the tires, like a dragging sound. As the noise from the tire grew louder, and the headlights continued their erratic blinking, I felt a deep sense of dread. We had to get off the road, so I turned onto a side street, hoping to find a safer spot to inspect the van. Despite my best efforts to find a cause for the malfunction, the noise persisted, and the headlights kept flashing. My family's anxiety was palpable, and their concern only heightened my own unease. We eventually decided to head back to my sister-in-law's house, planning to spend the night and sort everything out in the morning. But as we turned another corner, something unexpected happened. The flickering light suddenly stabilized. The noise from the tires ceased. It was as if whatever had been troubling us had vanished. I stopped the van to check once more. Everything seemed to be functioning normally. No more flashing lights, no more strange sounds. As I prepared to get back on the road, I glanced to my left. To my surprise, we were right in front of the beautiful church we had seen earlier in the day. The sight was almost comforting, a stark contrast to the eerie experiences of the past few hours. The church, bathed in the soft glow of its exterior lights, provided a sense of calm that we desperately needed. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something sinister. The idea that we had been guided away from Sybil North's house and back to the church seemed too coincidental to ignore. I felt a mix of relief and lingering anxiety as we drove away, heading back towards Albuquerque. The drive back to Albuquerque was eerily silent. No one spoke, and the atmosphere in the van was heavy with unspoken thoughts. The events of the night had left us all shaken. The malfunctioning headlights, the strange noises, and the coincidental encounter with my sister-in-law in such an isolated spot had a profound impact on me. The following morning, I inspected the van thoroughly. I checked the wiring, the lights, and even the tires, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Everything was in working order. It was as if the previous night's troubles had never occurred. Despite my detailed examination, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us, or that we had narrowly avoided a more troubling situation. This experience reinforced a belief I had long held. Sometimes, when you seek out trouble, it has a way of finding you. The strange coincidences and unsettling occurrences seemed to suggest that there was more at play than mere mechanical failures or chance. Whether it was the oppressive darkness of that road, or the eerie timing of the events, something had felt deeply wrong. The journey had been a test of nerves, but it also served as a reminder to trust my instincts. We had been guided away from danger, though I couldn't fully understand why or how. Socorro, once a place of routine, now felt imbued with a sense of unease, and I made a silent vow to stay clear of it in the future. As I looked back on the night, I realized that some experiences defy logical explanation. The fear and uncertainty we felt were real, even if the cause remained elusive. The night's events became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the thin line between the known and the unknown, and a testament to the mysterious ways in which fate sometimes intervenes. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.